This episode is sponsored by the One Membership by Template Monster. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the HTML All the Things podcast, episode number 66. What is JSON? I'm your host, Matt Lawrence, and I'm joined again by my co-host, Mike Curran. If you've been enjoying the podcast so far and you want to support us, there are a couple of ways you could do that. You can review us on the Apple Podcast or the podcast platform that you are listening to this on. You can also check us out on Patreon. We only have a couple of tiers right now, but that $3 tier will give you a shout out in the podcast, and we will share a link to your website in our show notes. And probably the most important one is just to tell your friends. Share this in any way possible. Let them know that we are here and we are ready to be listened to. And that's a dog barking in the background.
Yes,
and
I'm sorry about that.
And also we have a Discord server. So our Discord server is well over 200 members now. So it's finally... Well, on this, we really need to change this script. I almost say it, and I actually just did say it. It is... Apparently... Hang on a minute. I was going to read the script. Our Discord server has finally launched, and with it, we hope to create a community full of web developers from all walks of the industry. Join today. That's already been done, so just join the existing community, folks. But anyway, weekly pain point. Mike, who is remote, take it away.
All right. So this is the first podcast that we're recording remotely, and it's pretty remote. So I'm in Russia right now. It's where I was born. I'm visiting grandparents, some other family, and stuff like that. So yeah, my weekly pain point is definitely jet lag and just travel in general. It's definitely a downer. It's long, slow. I mean, I guess unless you're in business class, you can't really do anything. I was hoping to get some work done on the plane, but that did not work because there was such like little amounts of space that I couldn't get my laptop out and be comfortable at any way. Like I couldn't even really be comfortable, period. So with the laptop, it would be even worse. So I just kind of like sat there and stared at a screen for like the entire flight, watched some random movies and stuff like that, which was kind of But yeah, I'm becoming acclimatized. I'm okay here. Work has been going pretty well, so everything's kind of moving forward. So that was my weekly pain point. What about you, man?
So this week it kind of went a little bit ham, as Mike knows. So the instant he left, a lot of stuff started happening. Just on all fronts. So my weekly pain point is interaction overload, and that includes some training stuff, research, doing some support stuff, etc. So kind of doing everything in all realms that I could possibly be doing it in this job. Everything kind of lit up the radar this week, so just kind of overload in that way. But this is actually a Mike-heavy episode, despite him being remote. He wrote up most of the show notes here. So Mike, take it away with segment number 1.
All right, so this episode is going to be about JSON, and segment number 1 will talk about what is JSON. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It's a data storage standard that is considered to be a lightweight, and it's used for storing and sending data. Actually, most REST APIs that everyone's probably used or will use in the future will be sending a JSON response. I think before there was pretty common XML responses, but right now I think JSON is the dominant way to like send and receive data with an API. One great thing about JSON that's kind of better than XML, I would say, is that it's easy to understand. It's human readable, like in quotes, while also being very easy to parse, so computer readable. It makes it like the structure of a JSON object is very succinct, so you could see kind of like there's a data name with a value pair, and the data name will describe what the value it is holding, which makes it really simple, and it's structured really well with indents and commas and stuff like that, so you know the separation of data. Another thing is that it can be used to create, store, and send more complex data structures like arrays and stuff like that. So within arrays, you can kind of store objects. So you can have an array of objects that you can send over. There are a couple of limitations depending on what you're doing with the JSON. I know there was one limitation for storing. I remember with local web storage where you can't store like an object array when it's too far deep into your JSON structure. I'm not sure if that is still the case, but I know in some specific cases you can't store every kind of thing you want in a JSON structure. You kind of have to store it and then rebuild maybe if you want a more complex one. like maybe a list might be a little bit harder to store there. You might have to store an array and then kind of rebuild it into a list when you receive it back. Another thing is that JavaScript has built-in tools to work with JSON, which is kind of, really convenient, and why I think JSON has become so popular. One of the things is JSON.parse, which will take any string and create a JSON object out of it. Now, it will return an error if the string doesn't contain the proper formatting, because you need a proper formatted string object. So where this comes in handy would be, again, either receiving something as a string from an API and it having a JSON object stored in as a string. So that happens sometimes. Sometimes you want to just write up a JSON object in text. So maybe you have just a file, like a file that has a JSON object, a string object. And what you do is you'll import that as a string and then just use the JSON.parse to actually create a JSON object out of it that you can manipulate with JavaScript. So the strings have to have certain rules, and these rules are the same for the JSON object. So the data has to have a name and a value pair. Data has to be separated by commas. There has to be curly braces for holding an object, and then square brackets for holding arrays. So those really are the only rules inside of a JSON structure, which also makes it kind of simpler to understand, build, and create. Like it's just an easy way to kind of manipulate and function with data. So it shouldn't. My big thing with JSON is that I hope that it doesn't intimidate anyone to start using it right away. So when you're first learning JavaScript, when you're first learning HTML, CSS, you should maybe try to incorporate a little bit of JSON into your life as well, like with either like an API call here and there to figure out how the APIs work, how that data looks when you receive it, how you can manipulate it, how you can send it back. It's not a very complicated task, and it will go really far in the future, because as we're going to discuss in the next segment, a big portion of developing more complex applications is figuring out how the data works in your application. And a lot of that time it's going to be with JSON. Another cool function that JavaScript has built in is JSON.stringify, which will take any JavaScript variable, so not necessarily like an object or anything like that from JavaScript, and it will create a JSON object out of it. So you can create a JSON object from any variable, or from any from an array. You can kind of create a JSON object. You can do many things with this, and it makes it easy to kind of send as well. I think it's used a lot when you want to first, stringify your JavaScript object into a JSON object, and then send it to wherever you need to send it, either your server or an API call or whatever. So these tools make it really easy to work with APIs as well as send data back and forth to other apps. And that's really convenient because if you had to build your own structure to work with data, like I believe there's other data structures that aren't JSON and aren't XML that people use. And you usually have to use third-party extensions to kind of use those structures. Now, I don't know what they are at the top of my head. I'd love to hear more about them. I'm sure there's a lot of reasons to use different kinds of data structures for sending and receiving data. But for me, JSON has done everything that it could possibly need it to do. And with that, I think we'll move on to structuring data, which is segment 2.
I actually have a couple of questions.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the things I think, this is a question / comment. So one of the things that I think is kind of stopping people or barring people from pulling data into apps or their like web pages or whatever, especially if they're just getting started, is actually the introduction to APIs. So like calling an API is relatively easy. Usually there's a bit of a proprietary thing where, maybe you need to get an account or you need to do something to get an API key. And then once you have that, they want you to call, their stuff in a certain way, and they want you to treat their data in a certain way. Like, hey, don't be backing this up, or hey, please back this up. Don't keep calling my API, or like there's limits. Everything has like those proprietary steps. But, with that sort of logistical stuff aside, I think that there's actually a bit of a learning curve that isn't described anywhere well, I'd say, in how to actually call an API or what exactly is happening. Like, I would say that unless you know before or have it explained to you kind of verbally, or at least that's how I learned it, I actually didn't really know what was going on. Now, this was years ago when we were first getting started, but like I really didn't understand at all. Like you get an API key, and that's kind of like your password. Like that's your identifier. That's like authorizing you to pull this data because it's quote unquote like it's public, but it's not just like openly accessible. Like they don't want every person in the planet hitting their infrastructure. So like I guess what my question is with that comment is, do you kind of agree with that? Do you think that there is a bit of a lack or a bit of a lull in terms of tutorials on how to actually use API in terms of the initial connection? Like there's very little explanation as to what it is outside. Like when I was looking it up, it was always stuff like an API is like, whatever, I even forget what the thing is, but it's like a whatever program interface, and like you use it to like pull in data, and like that was always sort of the synopsis I would get. But then it's like, okay, but like how do I use this? Like where do I put this in my code? Like what am I doing here? And that was always sort of skipped over. And whenever looking at Stack Overflow articles and that sort of thing, I would always find that there would be more questions on like, hey, I have like this error with this API, but like I was always, when I was trying to learn it, I was always like, how the hell do I even make the call? Like, would you say that is would you say that there's a hole in sort of tutorials in that way? And would you say that there's like, that's sort of like one of the big leaps that people need to make that they're not doing?
So how I'll describe it is like this, from what I've learned with, and how I've learned API calls, is that certain, like if you're going into an API, let's say you're going for getting movie metadata, right? And they have an API, and you go to their page. I don't know which one; it doesn't really matter. But you go to their page. Most of the time, it'll just be like what you need to get their API, but not how, right? And that's your concern. Is like they're not showing you exactly how to do it. They're just giving you the key, the link. Maybe password and credentials, stuff like that. Like they're giving you a bunch of information, but not telling you how to put it together. And I think there is an issue with that, but it's also the thing where sometimes there's just too many different platforms that someone could use. So like with a movie data API, it could be, someone could be accessing from an iPhone, someone could be accessing from Android, someone could be accessing from web, someone could be accessing it from like any desktop application. Someone could be accessing it from a server. Like there's just so many different technologies to get API calls that it would be tough for every small API provider to provide the exact ways for everyone to be able to do it. Now, having said that, there are some that will legitimately give you the full request details. So like a lot of the time what it'll do is like they'll give you the information and then they'll be like, here's an example of how to call it. And there will be like 3 or 4 different tabs, and one will be like a curl request, one will be like a fetch, one will be a PHP request, one will be like, there'll be like 4 or 5 different ways that they'll show you how to get their information, and then what it looks like and how to parse it and stuff like that. There are some larger APIs that definitely do that, and that makes it easier to learn. Now, having said that, when you're talking about like just learning APIs and when you like Google APIs, a lot of the time you won't get that information because you'll just be shown like pages on what an API is, how to make an API, so that you can interact with it, rather than how to actually use and interact with the APIs. So it's kind of a weird in-between thing where it's like they just don't show enough information, or they're worried that they're going to show too much of it and confuse people. So what you usually have to do is like Google something different, like how to send a request to an API in JavaScript, and that will usually give you the right information with how to do it. Now, there's many different ways even inside of JavaScript to do it. There's different packages that are available. There's like the XHR HTTP requests that you can do. Those are the kind of the more older method, but reliable. There's the fetch method, which is now built into JavaScript, which works just fine as well. I use that quite often. And then there's like, for Vue.js, there's like an Axios package, and I think you can actually use Axios for many other, in any NPM provided project. And then it's the same thing for React. It has its own kind of like, API, XML, HTTP requests, like however it wants to do it. So there's many different ways to do it. So that's another confusing factor that I could see kind of being stopping force for some people, where they like go to it and be like, well, there's 15 different ways to do it. Why is there 15 different ways? So in my opinion, when you're first starting out, it doesn't really matter. Just pick one and try to use it. When you get to a more complex API structure, you'll know why those apply. There are reasons that there's many different ways to call an API. I'm not going to get into them right now because I think we're going to have an episode in the future talking about APIs, and I don't want to bullshit anyone with information that I don't have in front of me. So I think that's the answer to that.
Yeah, I would say that my main issue was like, cause that's exactly what I was trying to do, is access a movie database a long time ago, and I was just like trying to, like, I was able to connect to it, but we had like that weird problem, right, where I was trying to use Cordova, and so I was like trying to like connect to the API, pull in the information, and then have it work in Cordova. So like I think I was adding too many layers, and then the fact that the documentation, because I tried a couple of different APIs, the fact that the documentation in both cases had so many ways to do stuff, and then they were just like, oh, make sure you back all this up, or else like, you don't want to like, call too many times, or if you do this excessively we'll ban you and stuff. And it's like, whoa, I'm already like getting not threatened, but you're like, you're trying to learn, you're like, I don't want to get banned, I'm trying to learn what the hell's going on here, kind of thing. So it is like a bit overwhelming. I kind of think maybe we should do a tutorial, to be blunt. Like we talk like maybe like we're purists in terms of JavaScript and stuff for most cases. Like maybe we should make a tutorial and like, let's call, I don't know, this movie one, or let's call this bird type, or I don't know, something.
I agree. I kind of want to do a tutorial not only on just calling the API, but actually what to do with the data after. Like that's you were saying, some of them have limitations on how many times you want to use it, and so you can kind of store it, keep it for a certain amount of time, and then call it again. Like you can maybe do that twice a day, or you can do that once a day, or like you can set your own interval. So yeah. I might want to try to do a tutorial with that. And also manipulating JavaScript or JSON is a big one. And actually have a small tutorial up on Medium where it's manipulating JSON to build and structure a page. So you can check that out on our HTML All the Things Medium account. But with that being said, I think let's move on to segment 2, which is structuring data. So when first starting out on a larger project, I kind of always recommend to spend extra time to structure your data before beginning to write out or even plan your logic. So spending the time to do a simple, UML class diagram where you can work out what kind of relationships your data will have with each other and with your application and stuff like that can have a huge impact on your ability to finish a project. And don't be worried that I'm saying like a UML class diagram. You don't have to be like a software engineer or anything like that to go in and use a diagram. You don't even have to use it specifically. Like if you're doing something, a smaller project where maybe it becomes a little bit too, like there's just too much data for you to kind of comprehend in your own mind, just write down all the data structures that you have, all the different data that's going to be used in your project, and then try to determine what relationships it's going to have with each other. So is your user going to be able to interact with your shopping cart? Are your databases able to access anything in the website? Like stuff like that. It'll make it easier for you to round out your logic around it, and it'll make it easier for you to figure out what exactly you will need to build to interact with that data that you've written down. So with an API and server responses, you don't control them as well. So you always see what data is available. So what you need to do with an API is make sure that you know what it's actually sending to you. And that's a big thing too, because it's going to be sending you JSON, but how do you know what's actually inside of that JSON structure? So you know that you need, movie titles, you know that you need some sort of author, like, or the director, the actors and stuff like that. But what you'll sometimes find out is they'll have some extra information in there that you didn't think of before, but you might actually use. So for instance, going back to the movie example, what happens if they have the cover art link and you're like, oh, well, if they have the cover art link, I might as well use that. But then you're like, okay, so how do I want to do it? Do I want to just use that cover art link and then just like implement it into my application, like actually as a link in the source tag? Well, you can, and that's like for a smaller application, maybe that makes sense. But if you're anticipating lots of traffic to your site and you're anticipating lots of returning customers and stuff like that, it might not be the best idea, because you might want to think like, well, if too many people hit this API, like Matt was mentioning before with the limits, and if too many people hit this image source, then maybe that API will stop working for me, and that image source will stop working for me. So you won't be able to get the image back, and then you'll just see a blank box or like a sample image or whatever, however you set it up. So to mitigate that, again, you can just use that link once and set it up as download it to your server automatically, obviously, and then just replace the external link with your server link, and then you're kind of controlling your own hosting for that image. So it's just one little thought process that can go on when you are looking at an API response, when you're looking at your server request response, because sometimes if you're going into a project, maybe you're getting hired at a new company and you're going into a project and they're like, okay, well, update this screen on the page or something like that. What will happen is there's a lot of maybe server requests on that page. There's a lot of API calls. It's important to familiarize yourself with what information you're actually dealing with, because it can make your life a lot easier in the future. Like if you're going into a page and it has a bunch of information about a specific company, and they're asking you to add some more information about that company. Maybe it's like they want you to add the address and maybe when the company was founded. So you're like, okay, well, maybe I'll have to go online, Google when that company was added. But if you go back and you look at what that page is currently pulling, maybe it's already pulling information about that company because it was already, centered around there. And maybe that API that it's pulling from, or the server request that it's pulling from, has that information that you need. So it might be, a 5-minute job for you to just, use the variables already given to you, instead of going out and Googling it yourself, and then those become static. Ideally what you want to do is not have too many static variables when stuff can change. Like an address is a perfect example. If you use a static address that you just found off Google without linking it to anything, and that company moves, then you're kind of in a point where, let's say 2 years down the line, you can't maintain every single website that you've ever worked on. You forget that a customer goes to that site and they're screwed because that address is now different. So they go to a different site. People are angry, where this could have easily been prevented if you were using the API call that was maybe already available to you. So stuff like that is worth consideration when you're thinking about APIs and structuring data. And this isn't really going to be a tutorial on how to structure data, because it's a very visual thing. If anything, I would do a YouTube video on kind of my process of going through a simple website to how I build the JSON data structures for it, how I prototype with JSON. Like I like to do a lot of prototyping before I build API calls, before I build server responses, where I'll just build like local JSON data structures and see how my site will use them and manipulate them. Because a lot of the time when I do that, I can figure out what's like some issues. So sometimes it'll be like, I put an array inside of a JSON structure, but it's not accessible during this portion of the code. So what I'll have to do is I'll have to kind of like pull that array out of that JSON structure, put it into a different one where that is accessible and that makes more sense. So you structure your data before you build your servers, before you build your stuff like that. If you're on a small project, if you're working on it on your own, that's kind of how I like to do it. I'm more of a front-end guy anyway, so maybe there's a little bit of bias, but I do like to have my data very refined before I go and build out the actual server infrastructure that will be serving that data. And again, when I'm doing my own responses and calls, I do like to make my data human readable as much as possible. So I'm like proper name tagging for each value is important to me. So if it's like an author name, I want to put author name, not just name. If it's like an address, I want to put like store address, because they could have a PO box address, stuff like that. I just want to make sure that when a person is looking through my data in the future, they can understand it without having me having to build out a set of documentation and stuff like that for them to go through it. And really that's about it. That's about all I have to say about just JSON in general in a podcast format. What I will say is that if you are interested in JSON, I think I will be following this up with more JSON tutorials. Like Matt was saying, it's a good idea. It's something that I'm fairly versed in. Like I've done a lot of work with JSON API calls, API structure. So I think it'll be valuable for some of you. Let us know. You can contact us in our Discord, on Twitter, at HTML Everything, even Instagram at HTML Other Things and stuff like that. So just let us know if you want to see some more JSON stuff in the future. But with that, I think I'm going to pass it on to Matt if he has any questions, or moving on to the next segments.
Yeah, so I do actually have a question. So how much do you think that people should be, or how paranoid, I guess, should people be when they're thinking of being efficient with their data, like with the structures? So maybe like a couple of examples with that would be when they're learning or when they're making something for production. So how paranoid should they be? Should they be constantly checking to make sure they're being most efficient? And with that being said, how paranoid should you be, I'd say on average, because it changes per project, on how many API calls? Like, should you be scaling up so you expect, 100 hits, so you always buy 200? Or what would your estimation be?
Okay, so the first question was how efficient you should be with your data. And in that sense, if I'm understanding correctly, like how should your data be formatted so that you don't have anything excess, right? Like, so you don't have anything like, you don't have a whole database of data in your code that's not being used. Is that correct?
Well, like how efficient should you be? So like the first kind of use case I would think in my head is, let's say we made a website today and we finished it and that's really great. It's working. And then in a year, the customer approaches us and says, hey, we want to build something else. And so off the top of our head, we know how to make a fresh call and, let's say, pull in the sale prices of some objects. However, maybe that data, like you had stated in the segment, maybe that data is already being pulled in with something else. So, how paranoid should you be? Should you not care and just make that call because it's a quick, like, hey, let's just make another call, quickly pull that information in? Or should you always do research and be like, wait, is this actually being pulled in with anything else? Should you spend that time checking throughout the other calls to see if you could be more efficient?
I'd say, I think yes. I think making redundant calls isn't the greatest idea anyway, because again, it not only are you doing more network traffic, you have more points of failure for that network traffic to come back. You have more chances of that API call that you're making to overextend and like having to pay more for the API access or however you have it worked out. In my opinion, I think you should, because usually if you're just like, if it's a smaller website, you're probably not making that many API calls. So going through the 5 or 6 that you're making isn't going to be that huge of a deal, and seeing what the data is in there, like in the future, rather than just, doing it quickly and making the same API call twice, just to get like 1 or 2 pieces of data. That's my opinion. Whether that affects anything in the future, I don't know, but I think that it's better to structure your mind like that, because when you are working in a larger corporation, a larger company, and they're trying to squeeze as much performance out of their, very large applications as they possibly can, it will come in handy. So if only for that reason, it's worth it. But I think it could come into play for the fact that, again, you might be calling an API too many times and it could cost you more money in the future.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so you definitely should be not making a bunch of redundant calls, because it could get extremely costly if like that customer calls you back again, like 3 or 4 times, adding stuff. Yeah. So,
and then what was that? What was the second question?
That is a great question. It's 2:45 a.m. here, so I'm starting to fade slightly.
I don't get jet lag.
Yeah, you have jet lag, and it's 2:45 here, and I've been up since 8 a.m. So,
moving on.
Yeah, moving on. So moving on, actually, we got to remember that question. What was that question? We talk about APIs, and then there's a good question.
It was a good question.
It was a good question. See, we could listen to it back, but I don't know how to do that in the middle of the recording.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
I don't remember what the question was, but all right. Anyway, okay, we're moving on very excitingly to our very first sponsor spot, and I can already hear you folks hitting your stop button. This podcast sucks now. Blah, 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 as a sponsor. Well, that's nice. But anyway, Our sponsor is the One Membership by Template Monster, and that One Membership is your ultimate web development kit. It includes WordPress and CMS themes, e-commerce themes, powerful plugins, presentation templates, diverse graphics, unlimited installations, 24/7 technical support, and 1 year of free hosting. If you want to check that out, you can go to our link, tinyurl.com/html all the things, and you can get a 10% off, or you can get 10% off if you use the promo code HTML all the things 10. And now on to our web news segment, in between growing pains. So I was looking right at web news and I lost my place. Yeah, I'm starting to fade. Okay. Starting to fade real bad. Okay, here we go. We all know that as a company grows, there are a variety of growing pains that plague it at certain stages. This includes things like making enough money to hit certain tax thresholds, needing more than just loose paper for bookkeeping, and expanding one's arsenal of equipment. And most recently, we've run into a couple of growing pains that put us right in between two tiers of software. So, for example, we have a lot of customer interactions, so many, in fact, that tracking them would be really great, but we wouldn't use traditional CRMs to the fullest, and their price tag is rather pricey depending on which one you go with. We also have a contractor that works with us consistently, but all programs that we need for organization would only be used for a few minutes a day at our current scale, and that's really at most. Like sometimes you don't even really need to check your to-dos and stuff. And yet, the majority of software actually requires a full subscription per user per month or per year, depending on your commitment. And then we also have customer requests coming in that require a full set of skills. So a full set of research, then some design, then development, then deployment, and actually completed on timelines that push the boundaries of our current team's size. Yet these requests aren't frequent enough to get additional help or to maybe use some sort of freelancer network, not quite yet. So I have a couple questions here. How does one cope with being quote unquote in between these growing pains? And when should you just purchase the new software? So speaking about like the CRMs and that type of thing. And another thing, kind of a sub question, would purchasing something that isn't going to be used a lot actually help force you to drum up more business because you want to get your money's worth out of that purchase?
These are good questions, and this is more of a discussion, I guess, because I definitely don't have the answers to these because we're both in the same boat here, right? But in my opinion,
were you Minecrafting over there? I hear the bang, bang. Yeah. What's going on over there?
Just Minecrafting my way out of this desk. So, how does one cope with in between growing pains? That is a great question. I think what you have to do is you kind of have to think bigger rather than smaller. I think that's the way to do it, because one thing that it'll do is it'll prepare you for where you're heading, right? And number two is that it will kind of motivate you to head there quicker, if that makes sense. So instead of being like, okay, so we're in between the two tiers right now, like we're getting everything that we can out of tier one, for whatever software that we're using. Let's just make an example of like a task management software.
Yeah.
We're getting everything that we can out of this free tier or whatever. But right now we're getting to the point where like I need like capabilities of seeing how many to-dos that I've made in the past so that I can kind of, gauge how I'm doing on a day-to-day basis.
Yes.
But I don't need anything else really in the next tier until we bring on like our contractor in our to-do structure and stuff like that. So again, in between, I'm just giving a real world example because it's kind of where I am with this to-do list that I'm using called Todoist. And it's something that I have been considering. Like I might actually go for the paid tier on that one. So because I'm at that point, I could save some money and just kind of force myself not to use the paid features. And that's okay. But what I'm thinking is that if I were to pay for it, A, maybe it would affect my productivity in a positive way. And B, maybe it would force me to use it more often, to become more efficient, to use the tool that we're actually, paying for, and actually go to that next tier where I'm actually needing all the features of that tier, where it includes like multiple people being able to edit the list and stuff like that. That's my thought process. Now, having said that, let's say that we were to purchase the second tier and then not use it at all. Like, let's say I purchase this Todoist premium tier and I go and I'm like, okay, my habits haven't changed. I haven't really used any of the paid features. I think the smart thing to do at that point would be to go back to the free tier or to use a different application altogether. And I think it's a good way of ripping applications out that you're not using, that you have installed on all your devices and stuff like that. So maybe it'll force you to reconsider as well. So in my opinion, yeah, in between growing pains, go to next tier. What do you think?
Well, it's interesting because, so for example, we actually have like a big jump ahead of us. So we don't actually use a CRM at the moment. We kind of just like we've kind of almost used our heads as a CRM. We've had so you're using Todoist now. I use Microsoft's To Do. We also have a Asana, which I'm not sure if you use anymore. And so like there's a lot of software here that could really benefit us, but none of them do specifically one thing. And what the thing I'm having trouble with the most is like, here's a use case. A customer calls me up and says, we really need to discuss, I don't know, my calculator app. It's having trouble with the addition button, blah, 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 blah. Okay, we have a conversation, phone call ends. Then the next week, I've already had a bunch of phone calls with other customers, maybe even with that customer. And then that particular customer with the problem with the addition button calls me again and says, hey, do you remember what we were talking about last week? And the very first thing I'm out with is, no, what are you talking about? So I realize that's like a small use case problem, but we're having this issue where we have a lot of like support and a lot of questions and a lot of information that's coming to us from customers at this point. And it's getting to the point where what we used to do is just kind of look at our completed tasks in our various task managers, or look at what we completed on the websites, or just know from memory what we did on the websites. But now we're kind of being stretched thin across so many jobs that it's getting to the point where I just can't remember everything. And so the main feature I want from a CRM is literally a list of almost like a BlackBerry hub, if you will, per customer, where it's like, here's the customer's name and maybe some like other information like their phone number and stuff. And I just need a list of like, on Tuesday they called and this was the call notes from it. On this day they emailed me about this. On this day they gave me these tasks and I generated a task from that. And like maybe even start doing some things like automation in there. But the main thing I need like today is just that list. And so I kind of need a CRM right away. But then a CRM is like super fully featured. And yes, there's free ones, I understand. But in general, let's just say I need the paid tier in this case. It's like I'm not really getting the full use out of it. And even at those free tiers, there's a lot there that I'm not using. And so this is like a big jump for us. And so I think you're right, Mike, in terms of when you're already on the software and you need to make the jump. I would say that, like, if you need to use the premium feature on a consistent basis and not just once because it's kind of convenient, then yes, make the jump. For this, like, I don't know whether we should, because it's like, also, you're using different software than me. So realistically, This CRM is like for a team, but like, it's just me that would be using it.
Yeah, or we consolidate and use the same software for the same purposes.
Or we consolidate, yes. We could also consolidate, come up with like procedures in that, but then now we're running into the problem of, holy crap, like we have all these tickets and all these things coming in, which are not tickets, by the way. See, this is another problem, is I like doing things in, like I've always said, in like a ticket format. But now we're getting, and so like basically I was making tasks and those are my like quote unquote tickets. I would just do an order. But now I'm getting so much stuff coming in that I have to have things in separate screens, and I'm not like remembering exactly what I was supposed to do at this time. I'm not exactly remembering what I'm supposed to do for this guy. I'm not exactly remembering what we talked about and that type of thing. And so we almost need like help desk software to plug into that. But then it's also like, well, how many work orders are we going to do a week? 3? But what am I supposed to do?
It is expanding quickly.
It is expanding quickly. So it's like, I don't know. It's like a mental block or something. I think you're supposed to question, like, you're supposed to question proceedings like this. Like, I'm not just supposed to be like, oh, I need a ticket. Like I did that first day of the business, right? I need a ticket, so I'm going to get a help desk software. That's a bit overkill. We haven't needed it since until now. But maybe now it's time to start looking at a suite of products or a CRM that has a bunch of help, like it has a bunch of stuff like help desk software, or maybe it has integrations into existing help desk software that works with our existing email provider and that type of thing. So that's sort of like where we're at. And it's just sort of weird being in this limbo state where it's like, I am getting by, but not as efficiently as I was. And so like productivity and everything else is being hurt, but I also don't want to waste money. So yeah, it's a tough decision, but it probably should be a tough decision. And I will say that by purchase, like that last question there, would purchasing something that isn't going to be used a lot actually help force you to drum up more business because you want your money's worth? In terms of the CRM, I don't know if it would help me drum up more business necessarily right away, but the very first thing I thought of, and I actually just mentioned it, is I could have things like, instead of me typing in, oh, I made a call, I could have an automated thing that says, like, oh, you had a call, this was the duration, this is the time, and then have a notification automatically come up that says, like, please fill out the call notes once the call is concluded. See, I would already start to automate small things that I wouldn't necessarily think about. And so I would say to that question that is relatively true, because whether it's money's worth or productivity's worth, and time is money, that once you get in there, if you care enough, I think you're going to start messing around with it. I don't know if you have the same sort of idea.
I think I have the same thought process as you. I honestly think if we were to get the CRM, maybe you're right. It is a little bit overkill for where we're at right at this very second. But our plan is to get to the point where, and it in a very short amount of time, I think we will be at the point where we're going to very much use more features of that CRM. Like you said, we have a contractor that could be very efficient with that contractor. So he could go in and look at the notes from each call, check to make sure that he has everything that he needs from that and stuff like that, add notes to it. Like, I can see this going to our advantage. And if we were to buy it now and start using it now, we would become more familiar with it.
Yes.
To the point where when we need it, we can hit the ground running with it. So again, I think that the logic that I have applies here, where if we're at the point where we're in between, we should just get it. Like, it seems to make sense. Like, you're already just thinking about it shortly. You're already making logical steps into how you would use it to be more efficient. And right now, we like you said with the with your weekly pain point, you're in an overload. You're in an interaction overload, and this is literally designed to help with that. So I don't know. If it was me it is us making the call together. I would say we should at least attempt to start using it. And we should, in a sense where we should pay for it and use it. And if we really can't get the benefit from it, then we can have a separate discussion on that.
Yeah.
About why, and then maybe not use it and stuff like that. But I think...
because we can always dump it. We can always get rid of it.
Exactly. We can always get rid of it. But also in a sense, we shouldn't just dump it because we're not using it because we're just lazy.
Yes.
We should dump it if it's not meeting our requirements for how it's being used. So I think if we get it, let's really use it. Yes. I'll use it as well for my interactions and stuff like that. And let's make sure that we're both on the same page about it, kind of thing. So I'm in. My conclusion is we should get it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I would agree. And I just thought of two use cases as you were talking there of stuff that we could additionally use it for. And so this is good news, I think. One of the things that I always have trouble with is when I'm having a call or just a meeting with somebody, I never know where to put my meeting notes. Now that sounds really stupid, we'll put it in a notebook. Well, thanks, bud. Hit me up on Twitter. But when you sit down at a Zoom call or go to a conference room at a client's place, you write up notes, which is great, but then where do you put them? Do you automatically translate those into tasks? But sometimes they're not tasks, they're just informational. And so I was doing a task and then in the description putting the information. Then I would check off the task as complete and then lose the information. So there's one big thing. Another big thing would be that I think we would really benefit from being able to store what exactly we did. So a prime example would be I recently pushed a bit of a weird fix to a couple of WordPress sites that allow a couple of incompatibilities to be kind of overlooked and the user doesn't get affected by it. If that fix breaks in a year, I'm not going to remember what the hell I did. I'm not going to remember what files I touched. I'm not going to remember how to revert it. There's no way. There's no chance. And so how else would I write that down? But in a help desk software, I would, as long as I write my ticket out right and have a descriptive whatever and like actually write down what I did and what files I changed and what I changed in them, maybe even uploading those files to the help desk software, I can easily go back, and if the customer calls and says, hey, that fix you did for me last year, because that's a phrase they would use, right? Any customer, hey, that fix you did for me last year doesn't work, or something's wrong with it, can you go look? Right now, in a year, I would be like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. But if we have this software, I'd be like, give me a sec, and I can sort by, in this case, it'd be 2019. And I could be like, oh, fix, yep, here you go, here's a work order here. Are you talking about these links that weren't working? Yes? Okay, now I know what's going on. Yeah, I could take a look. And I already have like a bearing. Whereas, like, how many times have we coded something up or fixed something and then had to go back and been like, how the hell did I do this? And I think that that's like a huge time saving. So I'm also a yes now.
Yeah.
I honestly thought we were going to have conflicting points, but I think we've just talked ourselves into it.
Yeah, I think it just makes sense. The other thing is that we haven't mentioned this on the podcast yet, but we do have a customer that wants a CRM to be installed, and it would be nice for us to get more experience with it. Like we've both had kind of experience with it separately in using CRMs for other companies.
And I know an expert in it as well, like to help us.
Yeah. So we do have our sources for it, and we're not completely blind in CRMs, but I think us setting one up ourselves for our needs will not only like make us better at CRMs, but we'll know which one to use for which customer and stuff like that. Because I think what we're going to inevitably do is do some research and not just going to pick the first one that we see.
No, yeah.
And decide, and that will make us more knowledgeable with the decision for our customers. So in my opinion, yeah, like anyway, we both stated yes. So I think that's, yep.
That's it. Done. So that's our web news. That's how you talk yourself into
spending money.
Spending money. Well, anyway, I think we can run the old conclusion, mostly because I'm going to fall asleep.
Yeah. Let's do it.
So thank you for listening, and make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing on the platform of your choice. You can follow us on the socials via @HTMLAllThings. That's on Facebook and Instagram. You can also follow us on Twitter, which is @HTMLEverything. We're on Medium, and we're on GitHub. And remember, we're also on Patreon. That's patreon.com/HTMLAllThings. Check out the tiers and give that a go. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons. Sean from RabbitWorks JavaScript. You can find him at youtube.com/RabbitWorksJavaScript. Garrick from Local Path Computing and Web Design. You can find him at localpathcomputing.com. Craig, a.k.a. Cosworth. Ryan Gatchell from Blue Black Digital. You can find him at blueblackdigital.com. Chris from Self-Made Web Designer. You can find him at selfmadewebdesigner.com. And Tim from The Web Hacker. You can find him at thewebhacker.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you're listening to this on. And we are signing off.